Wow.
We're going to get started. Might have met somewhere. It's nice to see you again. You ready? Well, thank you all for coming this morning. As a little bit of housekeeping before we proceed, we do have parking validations in the back. So if you take your ticket, there's a machine. It will take it in and stamp it and spit it back out, and that's next to the water and back. Again, thank you for attending this press event. What we're hoping to do today is to acknowledge the passage of Senate Bill 2719, which provides a window of opportunity for survivors of childhood sexual abuse to bring claims against the perpetrators responsible for the abuse and the entities that were responsible for the activities that the children and the perpetrators were participating in at the time. It's a window that's going to remain open until April 24th of 2020. I should introduce myself to those of you who don't know me. My name is Mark Gallagher. I'm an attorney practicing in Kailua, and I have worked with survivors of child sexual abuse for a number of years and have partnered in a significant number of those cases with Jeff Anderson and Associates, which is a mainland law firm who is one of the leaders in child safety and bringing these types of cases to achieve justice for survivors of child sex abuse. The bill that we're here about was sponsored by Senator Maile Shimabukuro, who is here present with us today, and I'll invite up in a moment to say a couple of words. So after we address the bill and what the bill means, we do have a report that Jeff Anderson and Associates has prepared. I've distributed them among the chairs, and there are stacks in back, and we have some stacks up here. The report addresses largely the cases and claims involving the Roman Catholic Church in the state of Hawaii, which unfortunately had the majority of the claims under the old window for bringing these types of cases. The church is by no means alone in its responsibility for these types of claims. And after we discuss the report, I am going to invite up a survivor of childhood sexual abuse to speak about her experience, both back when she was a child and with her experience under the prior window law that permitted her to bring a claim. So without further ado, Senator Maile Shimabukuro, the sponsor of SB 2719.
Thank you very much, Mark. Appreciate it.
Well, good morning, and thanks to all of you for attending this morning. You know, this bill means so much to so many out there watching, and I hope that those out there watching who might be victims of child sex abuse will have the courage to come forward. Now you have until April 2020, as Mark said, to file a civil claim. You know, in my district out on the Leeward Coast, so many of my constituents, you know, are stuck in a cycle of dysfunction. And, you know, as you know, on the Waianae Coast, there are a lot of homeless. We have a lot of people who are chronic drug users. And many people view them in a negative light. But the sad thing is, if you talk to many of these people who are addicted to drugs, who are living in the streets, who are runaways, etc., 9 times out of 10, they're victims of child sex abuse. And it's very shocking when you hear their stories. And you know, I just can't tell you the kind of pain that so many of these people have been through. And to many that don't know, you look at them and you just think, oh, they're just drug addicts. They're just homeless. You know, they're just, you know, people who sit on the side of the street. There's a reason why so many of them are depressed and so many of them have such low self-esteem. and many of it stems from childhood sex abuse, sadly. And I think that what's great about this law finally passing is that it's finally showing both the victims and the abusers out there that this is wrong. It's not your fault if you're a child sex abuse victim, and that if you are a perpetrator, it's not okay. It's not something that is acceptable in our society to do, and there are consequences. I want to acknowledge, Christine Johnson, who might be out there somewhere, and she's a constituent of mine, and she was the first person back in 2012 who asked me to introduce this measure. And it was her coming forward and bringing this to my attention that made me look into this issue in the first place. And I'm so grateful for her advocacy and courage. And what was wonderful about that bill back in 2012 is not only did it open the window for 2 years at that time, it also raised the age of the time limit, because at the time, if you were a victim of child sex abuse, you had to file a civil claim by age 20, which was quite ridiculous. When you're 20, you're still a child, really, and you're still so immature. And so that bill, not only did it open the window for 2 years at that time, it also raised the age to age 26. So as a victim of child sex abuse, you have until 26 to file a claim. We still think that's too young, and this year's bill tried to raise it to a much more mature age. I think it was 50, and that would have been much better, but at least it's 26. Also, the other thing that bill did back in 2012 is it increased the amount of time if you have a repressed memory of child sex abuse. I think the prior law might have been 1 year, and it raised it to 3 years, or 2, yeah. So if you have a repressed memory of child sex abuse and it comes to the surface, you now have 3 years to file a civil claim. I want to also acknowledge Representative Melly Carroll, the late Melly Carroll. She introduced a bill that passed a couple years ago, and it removed the statute of limits completely for criminal cases. So if you are a victim of child sex abuse, egregious types of sex abuse, there's no time limit now to file a criminal case. So very good news for those types of cases. I also want to acknowledge Representative Linda Ichiyama. She is in the House and she's the one who introduced actually this bill this year. I had kind of given up. The last 2 sessions we tried this bill and it died, but she didn't give up. And I think the Me Too movement, the Kamehameha Schools, some of the other lawsuits that have really brought this to light, really have really encouraged others to come forward. And so Representative Ichiyama, I think, saw that and saw that we might still have a chance. And so she's the one really that put the bill forward and gave me the companion to introduce. So thanks to her. Thanks also to Representative Scott Nishimoto, House Judiciary Chair. He actually prioritized this bill, SB 2719, over his own House bill and had the courage to schedule it. There was some opposition for the Attorney General. And so I really want to acknowledge his courage as well to bring this forward. So thank you so much. Without further ado, I want to bring up Joelle, I think is the next speaker. I think is she the next? Okay. But thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Present with me at the podium is Joelle Casteix. Joelle is, I think that the way that I should invite her is a fighter for survivors of child sex abuse. She's an author and a TED speaker on the topic. Also, we anticipate having a survivor come up and speak, but I'd like to invite her up now so that we can make the introduction.
And if there are any other survivors who would like to come up and stand here with us while we talk, they're welcome to. And anyone else who's fought on behalf of this bill, Carolyn, if you'd like to stand up here with us, you're more than welcome to. But if you would like to stay back in the audience, the reason that I'm inviting other people up here with us is that this bill was not a single-handed effort. This report is not a single-handed effort. The only reason that these people have been exposed, and we have the information that we do, is because brave survivors have come forward, is because people have been working very, very hard to make sure that wrongdoers have been exposed and that cover-up has been exposed. This has been a team effort, and it's been led by strong and brave survivors. And we always need to keep that in mind. It's always about the survivors.
And so since we do have some survivors who have come up, to my left is June Cleghorn. She is a survivor and an individual who took advantage of the window statute that was passed originally in 2012 and then expanded in 2014. And John Pedro, who is also a survivor, who brought a claim and originally volunteered not to step forward as a claimant, but as a witness to support others. So thank you, John. Thank you,
And Carolyn, if you'd like to stand up, Carolyn Galoyus is a fighter on behalf of many, many survivors. And she was the one who went to the Capitol and fought very hard on behalf of this bill. And that's why she's up here, because if without her, we wouldn't be, able to do a lot of the things that we do. And Maile as well. So we want you to share while we talk about this as well. All right. So Mark,
Okay. Thank you.
no, you stay up here while if that's okay with you. Yeah, while Mark goes through, and
Okay.
because this is a group effort, truly.
And it truly is a group effort. We thank the legislators, but I wanted to personally thank all the people who did lobby the legislature, who provided testimony, written testimony, and who went down and testified in person, because those things make a difference. It's the voices of survivors being heard by the legislators and action taken by the legislators and the governor who did sign it on July 5th. So the next place that we wanted to move on to is with respect to the report that we have. The report, as I said, has been distributed. It was prepared by Jeff Anderson's office. The report categorizes the abuse situation and the problems that the Roman Catholic Church in the state of Hawaii has had over the years. We had a number of claims involving the church under the prior window statutes. My understanding from church attorneys is that they ultimately had over 100 cases that were brought. But the church is certainly not alone in terms of responsibility for these types of situations. There were claims brought against private schools, institutions such as scouting organizations, and other religious organizations. Really any organization that could have responsibility for children and the perpetrators has had some issue with this. The Catholic Church report is important in that it shines a light on the scope of the problem and how these things came to be a problem over the years. It's not simply about the church. They're an example of a problem that, as we've seen, is societal wide, and that the Me Too movement in recent years certainly has been indicative of. The different groups of survivors are finding their strength, they're finding their supporters, and they're able to step forward and do something about what happened to them. The report, when you get into it, talks about our perception of the reasons why this was a problem. The first reason is that the church valued its reputation over the safety of children. Any organization, when it values its own interests and its own reputation over the safety of children, places children in a dangerous situation. Cases like the ones that we've brought enable or really force those priorities to switch so that children are rightly prioritized at the top, the reputation of the institution below. The lack of actions when reports were made is supported by the documents that we've attached to the report. For example, Bishop Ferrario, former Bishop Ferrario, was an individual who many reports have been received about. He had been a problem for a number of years, and yet he was elevated to the position of bishop because the reports, when they were made, nothing significant was ever done about them. Another example of problems that the church had and other organizations have is a lack of effective governance. When you have somebody at the top of the organization, such as Bishop Ferrario, who is an abuser himself, it's impossible for that organization to effectively enforce the safety regulations regarding the safety of children, because you have the top violating it. Another issue that is highlighted in the report is that the church for years had a kind of a reputation as a dumping ground for troubled clerics from the mainland. So they would be sent out here to get them out of trouble or attention on the mainland or other places. And that's the map that we have here, shows the sources of clerics over the years for the Diocese of Honolulu. You can see they came from all over the world, from as far away as Ireland or Peru, various places in the mainland, China, Philippines, Guam. The last, thank you, Jim. The last thing that I wanted to point out that is addressed in the report about why there was a problem is that years ago, these types of issues, abuse of children, weren't treated as criminal violations by the institutions that the children were subject to. If an organization simply refers a perpetrator to internal processes of discipline, tells them don't do it again, that's not an effective way of stopping childhood sex abuse. These are criminal acts, and the organizations have to respond to them as criminal acts and do the right thing, which is to involve law enforcement in them. So that is the my summary of what the report provides. We do also identify perpetrators associated with the Diocese of Honolulu. We have 58 individuals. There are assignment histories in the report that would give you the information regarding the locations that these clerics were in Hawaii and various other places and the relevant time periods. At this time, I think I'd like to invite Joelle to say a few words.
You can come in a little closer, too. My name is Joelle Casteix. I am a survivor of child sexual abuse, and I've been fighting on behalf of other survivors for about the past 15 years. I've also written several books, and I work very, very hard to inform parents about what to do to prevent the cycle of abuse from continuing. And this report contains a lot of very ugly and scary information. And since I've been working with survivors on Hawaii since 2012, we have seen the layers of the onion peel back and more scary and ugly information come forth. And people keep trying to tell us that this is old news and an old story, but it's not, because people don't know the extent of the cover-up. These are names that people don't know. There are survivors out there who are still struggling in shame and silence and secrecy. We are here today to let people know that it is safe to come forward and talk about what you know. It is safe to come forward and say, yes, this happened to me. Because institutions such as the Catholic Church or the Hawaii Preparatory Academy or Kamehameha provide a safe haven for perpetrators of child sexual abuse, because they provide cheap forgiveness for perpetrators, because institutions will always side with an adult over a child, because adults have instant trust. Adults get instant forgiveness. And so what we need to do is we need to start believing our children, and we need to start believing our vulnerable and scared adults who were hurt so horribly when they were children. This law is revolutionary in Hawaii. It has allowed us to expose, allowed brave survivors to expose all of these men across the state, men who never would have been exposed had we not allowed survivors to use the one thing they have, their voice, to expose the truth and documents. We have men in powerful positions today within our government who have been accused in lawsuits of sexually abusing children. Me Too has shown us that this is no longer acceptable anywhere. And we need to do everything we can to make sure that these men are removed from their jobs. We need to do everything that we can to make sure that people who sexually abuse children are no longer tolerated in our society. And this law is a brave first step. So I encourage everyone who has been sexually abused as a child or who has witnessed this kind of abuse to come forward and do everything you can under this law to break the cycle, because it's the strongest thing we have to ensure that what happened to me and what happened to June and what happened to the victims on these boards and what happened to John never happens to another child in the state of Hawaii. And now, and now I would like to introduce June and her very, very powerful story.
Oh, mahalo. Thank you. And thank you and mahalo to everyone that's worked towards getting here. And yeah, I have a statement to read that I just want to make sure that I get my message across. My name is June Johnson Cleghorn, and while this report we've just heard about speaks to the atrocities that have occurred in the Catholic Diocese in Hawaii, I'm here today to briefly share my story as a victim of sexual abuse endured by another institution in our state. In April of 2014, just days before the window law expired, a legal complaint was filed that named me as Jane Roe number 30. The complaint was filed against Hawaii Preparatory Academy, or HPA, where I began as a 12-year-old boarding student in 1971 and graduated 6 years later, during which time I was continually molested by one of the teachers there, Lauren Barker, a trusted authority figure, outwardly well-liked, actively engaged with all students, faculty, and administrators, an effective educator. He was also, secretly at the time, a master manipulator and pedophile. My legal complaint was settled in 2016, 2 years after filing. It was a long legal process, but a process that ultimately allowed me to gain control of what happened to me, to find my voice and take control over my story. As a 12-year-old girl, Barker groomed and manipulated me. He manipulated my friends and peers as well. And before the end of that first year as a boarder, he began having sex with me. This sexual abuse continued for the next 6 years while I was an HPA boarder and even beyond that. A main part of what allowed the abuse to continue was the secrecy involved. It was this secrecy that was ultimately the most damaging. Through the legal process afforded to me with Hawaii's window law in 2014, I put an end to that secrecy. My legal complaint demanded that HPA admit responsibility for their negligence in my care and protection from that abuse during my critical adolescent development. And it demanded that Barker take responsibility for his heinous and despicable actions. After resolution of the case, HPA did an incredible thing. They agreed to my request and welcomed me to speak openly with their school community. All faculty, staff, and administrators, about my experience there. The intent was to end the secrecy surrounding this abuse and begin an open conversation about sexual abuse and ways to prevent it. An unfortunate fact we all know is that inappropriate sexual encounters between trusted adult authority figures and minor children and adolescents occur all too often at many institutions. When these facts are brought to light, evaluated, and ultimately decided, the only choice I believe these institutions have if they want to continue operating, is to accept responsibility for their actions, own any and all mistakes they made, learn from them, and work openly to make changes to better ensure safety and security for the children and adolescents in their care. HPA did this. They prioritized the safety and security of the children in their care by inviting me in to help them in this endeavor. And because of it, I believe there's hope. Hope for changes to be implemented that will prevent future abuse and result in safer environments for their students. I am proud of what I have accomplished by taking advantage of and taking action through the use of this window law. It wasn't easy to take this step and enter into a lengthy legal process that deconstructs the abuse that occurred. I had to again experience the shame and isolation that results from not only the abuse, but also from years of secrecy that led to inaction by the adults that were supposed to protect me. To other victims in our community, I urge you to put an end to the secrecy and reach out to the advocates such as these here today and begin to find your voice and can take control of your story. I truly believe that if you do, the isolation and shame you may be feeling will start to fade. You will find support, and you can gain back your confidence and enjoy the benefits that are sure to result. Mahalo, and thank you very much.
Well, we have another survivor up here, but I don't know that you passed. Okay. John had come to support, and I appreciate that, but I didn't want to deprive you of an opportunity if you chose to take it. Thank you, June.
Thanks.
Oh, June, don't walk away.
Yeah. You're not allowed to run away now.
Yeah. So I want to thank June for that wonderful statement. That is the type of change that we're hoping that this law will enable other survivors to continue making in our community, and that other organizations will step forward and do the right thing and protect children and acknowledge the pain that the survivors have gone through. So I don't have anything. Joelle, do you have anything further you'd like to add?
No, it really is about the positive pivot.
Joelle, I'm going to interrupt you for 1 second.
Okay.
John Pedro would like to say something.
Yeah.
It started with validating somebody's story by the news article that I saw on the TV. And that's all it was going to be, was just to validate his story. But I encourage everyone to not only validate, but also come forward, because as my wife told me, that they need to be held accountable.
Okay. John. Thank you, John. As I mentioned before, John's story, as he alluded to, is he just stepped forward as a witness, and it was in a Catholic Church case involving St. Anthony's out in Kadua, and stepped forward to do the right thing. Ultimately, later brought a claim. But thank you, John. And Joelle, I had cut you off because I knew John had something to say. But
And then he just reaffirms what I was going to say. It's all about the positive pivot. We're all making a positive pivot towards healing. And that's what this is all about doing the right thing and saving children's lives and making that positive pivot towards healing.
okay, thank you. That's all of our prepared remarks.
And we'll
but
take
I'm
any
sure
questions.
we'll have questions.
Mark, of all of those people up there priests, how many are still alive? I know that we can hold institutions responsible, but what about the titles themselves?
The numbers that we have up here, I couldn't tell you how many are currently alive. Whenever we have brought an action and the perpetrator is alive, the perpetrator is always named as a defendant in that action, because it's very important that perpetrators take responsibility for what it was and have to confront their actions. In instances where the perpetrators are not alive, then the issue is the responsibility of the institution. And we do proceed against the institutions that are responsible, because it's the institutions really that need to affect the change. One perpetrator can be incarcerated, and that's the best thing for most of them. But if the institution doesn't change, then there is the opportunity for other perpetrators within the institution to commit the same act.
Institutions follow patterns of behavior, and we've seen that within the Catholic Church, the Boy Scouts of America, U.S. Gymnastics. And if you take out a perpetrator and you put that perpetrator in jail and you don't take out the patterns of behavior, another perpetrator is attracted and just plugs right in. And so that's why these civil lawsuits are so vitally important, because what they do is they expose those patterns of behavior so that you can peel away those layers of the onion and you cannot plug in another perpetrator. You take away the patterns that allow the abuse to flourish and continue.
Were any of these 58 individuals tried and convicted of child sex abuse?
Yes.
Yes.
How many?
I can't tell you how many.
A particular example would be Robert Bruyette, who has been convicted of possession of child pornography. He was netted in an internet child sting, but he has been all over the country and has been, there's been numerous civil cases against him. Let's see, most of these men have been implicated in other civil sex abuse cases. Who is Ford? Thomas Ford was convicted in Canada for beating children. Let's see who else is in here. So there are other men who have been, and the thing is, when you have cover up within an institution, one of their primary goals is to make sure that these men they escape criminal conviction. So when you have these civil cases, you uncover documents such as what you see in the report, one of the documents by Robert Browne in the psychiatric case of Father Jackson, talking about his feelings towards teenage boys. Now, what really should have happened is the diocese should have picked up the phone and called the police. He would have been in jail, but they didn't. They sent him to a psychiatrist instead. So that's why most of these men don't have convictions, because they were covered up by the institution.
And just in follow up to the earlier question about who's alive, since Brother Briette's name came up, Brother Briette is a defendant, or was a defendant in multiple cases, and he is still living. Yes, Cindy.
Sorry, Kelly. Of all 58, there have been claims brought against them, correct?
Either in Hawaii or in other jurisdictions. They're all connected to Hawaii.
Yes.
Also, I think you need to connect the military in all this, because Father McNeely was a former Navy personnel, and he retired here. There is a system where sometimes the diocese will send a problem priest into the military.
Yes, that is true.
And so the military doesn't know this because their files are secret. And so they go out, and we were in Europe when this priest ended up being taken off in handcuffs, shackles, I wanted to say. And now he's at Fort Leavenworth, if he's still alive. And so these connections just go around the world and keep coming back. But that priest, as far as I know, was never in Hawaii, but he was. And it was through education. A preschool did a safe touch exercise and had the shore patrol come in and assist them. And from there, one little boy, one preschooler, said, well, this happens to me when Father so-and-so puts me to bed. And see, Catholics are so ingrained that the priests sit up in that pedestal, and families are so touched and honored that a priest would want to hear the child's bedtime prayers and tuck them in. And they had no idea. Once that child came out, then others popped up all over the base. That was in Sigonella, Sicily, off of the island of Italy. And so, see,
And it shows that, especially within an institution where these men have a big position of power, it's very scary for children to come forward and talk. Are there any other questions?
Are any of them still priests currently practicing here in Honolulu?
There are some with questionable status. Mark Alexander works within the Kirk Caldwell administration. We don't know what his status is as a priest. We don't know if he's been laicized. George DaCosta is a retired priest. We don't know if he's been laicized.
I believe he has.
Oh, he has been laicized?
Yes.
There are others who have weird status. Brother Bruyette he's still a brother. Is Funchin still a priest, or has he been laicized?
I'm not certain about.
Yeah,
Funchin.
so they're just kind of in this weird status because the Catholic Church has this feeling, well, once a priest, always a priest, and getting laicization is really, really difficult.
Yeah, the church will oftentimes take them out of circulation, so to speak, where they're not actively acting as priests. But the question of whether they're still technically a priest or not is something that is church process and procedure that is really a question better put to the church.
Father Art O'Brien, he said he pleaded no contest because he didn't want to hurt the children and make them come forward. So his case, but he still was put with a probation officer, and the diocese sent him out on weekends to unsuspecting parishes where he had contact, which was against the court decision. He was not to have any contact with in a parish city, and he was, because he came to our church, and that's when, it just got.
Yeah, when we have this number of perpetrators, there are hundreds of stories about individual priest perpetrators and the children that were the victims and survived the sexual abuse. And our focus today is rightly on that, on those children, but on the positive that can come out of bringing cases like this and exposing these issues to light so that change can be made. And I hope and believe that the church in Hawaii is trying to make changes and has resolved all the cases that I brought under the prior window. And I hope will continue to be constructive in making changes that are necessary. But it, like any institution, needs continued motivation to do so. And that's what we're hoping to accomplish.
And the only way to do that is to give survivors the power. Allow survivors the ability to own their story and give them access to the courtroom. And that's what this law does.
Do we have any other questions? Yes.
I'd like to speak, but I don't want to be on camera. I want to remain anonymous.
Then let's address that after the cameras are off. But thank you for coming. Okay, if there's nothing else, and thank you again for coming. Again, there's parking validation in the back. Make sure you put your ticket in there. It will pull it in, stamp it, so that you don't have to mortgage your house to get out of the parking.
And we're also available for individual interviews and things like that.
Okay, thank you. That was wonderful.